Hi, I'm Maribel, and this is the story of how I paid the mortgage on my parents' house, only to be left with a tool shed and a smile that didn't reach their eyes. They said my brother deserved everything, so they gave him everything. But what they forgot was who held the deed beneath their pride. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like your value in the family depended on how useful you were? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This isn't just a story about inheritance. It's about the quiet kind of power that no one saw coming. They say family is who's there when you need them. But what if you're there and they act like you're not? The wind carried the scent of chimney smoke and damp leaves as I swept the narrow path outside my shed. My boots crunched on scattered acorns and brittle twigs. Mom's voice floated through the window of the main house like a cold draft. "Don't block the driveway. Jared's arriving soon." She didn't yell, but she didn't have to. Her tone always had a way of making me feel like I'd left something wrong where it didn't belong, usually myself. I leaned the broom against the shed's door frame and glanced toward the house. The roof tiles still sagged slightly from last winter's storms. I'd patched them 2 months ago, quietly, without being asked. Just like I'd paid the overdue heating bill last year. Just like I'd picked up her prescription after the surgery, while Jared sent one apologetic text from Atlanta. Inside the shed, it was quiet. Bare, but clean. My bed was tucked against one wall. A small heater purred beside it. I hung my coat next to the shelf of canned goods I'd stocked for the cold months. On the narrow table sat a manila envelope. I hadn't opened it yet. I didn't need to. When Mom slid it across the counter this morning, she didn't look at me. "This is just formal," she said, almost bored. "You'll understand." I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a moment. The last time I'd seen a legal envelope on that counter, it was when Dad had updated his will, back when he was still alive, and still made me coffee before school. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the smell of that kitchen then. Toast, cinnamon, the faint cologne he used to wear. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shed's window. I stood and grabbed the soup I'd reheated earlier and tucked it into a paper bag, along with some crackers and tissues. 10 minutes later, I was knocking on Mrs. Thorne's screen door. She opened it slowly, wrapped in a thick flannel robe, her gray hair tucked behind her ears. "Oh, honey," she said with a smile that pulled gently at her cheeks. "You read my mind." "It's just soup," I replied, stepping inside. "Nothing fancy." Her home was warm with the scent of cloves and wool. The wall clock above her bookshelf ticked loudly, then chimed 4 as I poured soup into her favorite chipped bowl. We sat in her little kitchen nook, the same one where she used to tell me stories when I was a child, about her late husband's jokes, her garden before her knees gave out, her secret love for jazz. She took a few sips and looked at me, eyes soft but searching. "How's your mother?" she asked gently. I let out a dry laugh. "She's preparing for Jared's return, with the usual fanfare." Mrs. Thorne nodded knowingly. "Still believes he walks on water, does she?" "He's good at showing up when it counts," I said, then immediately regretted it. "I mean, when it's public." She reached out, her fingers brushing mine lightly. "You're kind, Maribel. Sometimes too quiet for your own good. But people notice, even if they pretend not to." Before I left, she shuffled to her bedroom and returned with a small envelope. "Not for today," she said. "Just when you need it." I tucked it into my coat pocket, unsure whether to smile or cry. Back in my shed, the light was fading. The shadows lengthened over the gravel path, and the old heater hummed its slow, faithful tune. I lit the lamp on the side table and sat down with the envelope from Mom. My fingers hesitated, but eventually I opened it. The words were dry and direct. The property, assets, all holdings, left entirely to Jared Quinn. I scanned every line, hoping to find my name somewhere. It wasn't there, not even as an afterthought. My throat tightened, but no tears came. I folded the paper back into its envelope and placed it next to Mrs. Thorne's. One, a reminder of what I'd lost. The other, a thread I wasn't sure I had the strength to pull yet. I stood up, restless. The shed felt smaller somehow. I reached for my laptop and opened it, clicking through familiar files until I found the draft I'd written but never sent. I placed the will back in the envelope, then reached for my laptop and opened a saved but unsent email titled, "Quiet Investments, Big Impact." The warmth of a home means nothing when you're asked to stay out of sight. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and cornbread when I slipped through the back door. Mom stood at the stove, stirring something in her favorite red enamel pot, her hair pinned neatly into a twist. She didn't glance up when I walked in, but she said, "Maribel, Jared's plane just landed. Make sure the guest room's warm." She still called it the guest room, though it had never been offered to me. I nodded, even though I'd already turned the heat on that morning. She added, "And don't forget, the good napkins, the embroidered ones." By the time Jared walked in an hour later, snow flurries had started to swirl outside. He stepped into the foyer with his usual unhurried grace, expensive cashmere coat still crisp from the dry cleaner. Mom rushed to greet him, arms outstretched. "There's my boy," she cooed, burying her face into his shoulder. I hung back near the kitchen, clutching a folded towel, suddenly aware of how faded my denim jacket looked in the lamplight. Jared glanced at me and gave a casual wave. "Hey, sis," he said. "Didn't expect you'd still be around." Still. The word clung to me like smoke. We sat down for dinner. Well, they sat down. Mom had arranged the table with her usual holiday flair, even though Thanksgiving was still 2 weeks away. I was tasked with keeping the food warm and refilling the bread basket. My seat was at the far end, by the swinging door, close enough to serve, not to talk. Jared launched into stories about his office in Boston, his latest promotion, the gym he'd joined but rarely used. Mom beamed, hanging on every word. I nodded politely, not that anyone noticed. The fire crackled in the hearth, and steam fogged the windows. "So," Jared said between bites of roasted chicken, "I was thinking, if I move back, maybe we should redo the backyard. Tear down the shed, put in something useful." Mom clapped lightly. "Finally! That old thing's such an eyesore." I forced a smile. I live there. Have you ever felt like I do now? The feeling of being an extra, invisible person in your own family, when even your home becomes something they plan to erase. If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 8 below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. Jared blinked. "Oh, right." The silence that followed was short, but thick. I cleared the plates without being asked and excused myself, mumbling something about needing to check on a neighbor. Neither of them looked up. Outside, the cold was sharp enough to make my eyes water. Or maybe it wasn't the cold. I walked the narrow path toward Mrs. Thorne's house. Her porch light was on, casting a yellow glow over the snow-dusted bushes. She met me at the door in her slippers, clutching a tissue. "Oh, sweetheart, you didn't need to come." "You weren't at dinner," I said softly. "I wasn't invited," she smiled gently, stepping aside. "But come in. I made chamomile." We sat in her little kitchen, the steam from our mugs fogging the window behind us. Her clock chimed 7. I didn't tell her everything, but I didn't have to. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You give more than most, Maribel, and they'll only notice when you're gone." The words landed softly, but deeply. I left her house with the smell of dried herbs clinging to my coat. The path home was quiet, the snow thicker now. In the shed, I lit my small desk lamp and sat at my laptop. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a long while. Then, with a single breath, I moved the cursor to the button I'd ignored for too long. That night, I finally hit send on my email. "I'm in. Let's finalize the acquisition." They forgot I was part of this home, but they never checked whose name was on the land. The smell of dark roast and cinnamon hung in the air as I pushed open the door to Ginger Brew Cafe. The bell above it jingled softly, same chime I remembered from college. Back then, I used to work the early shifts before class, wiping tables and learning the difference between a dry cappuccino and a flat white. Now, I was just another regular with a laptop and a plan no one saw coming. I claimed my usual seat near the window, where the radiator hummed and the morning light filtered through lace curtains. Outside, Fairwill was still waking up, storefronts flipping their closed signs, old men brushing snow off pickup trucks, and Mrs. Carpenter walking her dachshund in a pink sweater. I pulled out my laptop, connected to the cafe's slow but loyal Wi-Fi, and opened the video call. Thomas's face appeared, sleek as ever, suit perfect, even at 7 a.m. "Good morning, Maribel," he said, sipping from a sleek steel tumbler. "You look, Vermont." "I'll take that as a compliment," I smiled. "Did the paperwork go through?" He nodded. "All finalized. You now control the LLC that owns those 3 downtown parcels and the 2 acres directly behind the Quinn house. I let that settle. The land Jared had casually offered to redesign last night. Already signed, sealed, and quietly transferred, thanks to a trust Mrs. Thorne helped me establish 2 years ago. I'd forgotten just how generous her name carried weight in this town. "Any pushback?" I asked. "None. Mr. Adler signed off last week. Speaking of which, I'm seeing him today." We wrapped the call, and I let the screen dim. Around me, the cafe stirred with life. Nora Reynolds was filling out her crossword in pen again, muttering to herself. Hank poured his second cup of black coffee, tipping the waitress with exact change. I reached into my purse, brushing past the still unopened letter from Mrs. Thorne, and pulled out a yellow folder marked Quinn Easement. Mr. Adler's office was just across the street, above the pharmacy. He greeted me with the same warm nod he'd given since I was in high school. "Miss Quinn," he said, motioning me in. "Or should I say, managing member of Belrose Holdings?" "Maribel's fine," I replied, sitting opposite him at his big oak desk. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the paperwork. "Everything's in order. The zoning transfer on file, and the LLC legally controls all improvements and development rights on the parcel." I leaned back, letting that sentence wash over me. This wasn't revenge. It was a quiet reclaiming of space, on paper, in legacy, and in presence. "I assume your brother doesn't know?" he asked gently. "No one does. Not yet." He closed the folder. "Then I'll see you at the planning meeting next month." Back at the cafe, I ordered a second cup. The barista handed it over with a smile and a nod toward the tip jar. I dropped in a 5. It's what I always do, even now. Old habits. As I sat back down, a familiar pair of silhouettes passed outside the frosted window. Mom and Jared, walking briskly down Main. She held onto his arm, laughing at something I couldn't hear. Neither looked in. Neither saw me. I sipped my coffee, folded my documents neatly, and watched them disappear into the bakery. My fingers didn't shake. Not this time. I pulled out my phone, opened the last thread from Thomas, and typed slowly. I text Thomas. They're planning a Thanksgiving dinner. I'll be there. They thought I was just a guest at their table. Until I brought the deed. The dining room was glowing in amber light, the fireplace casting soft shadows on the walls lined with framed school photos and antique plates. The table was set with all the familiar dishes: Mom's cranberry sauce with orange zest, the cornbread stuffing that always came out too dense, and a roasted turkey that looked better than it tasted. She'd polished the silverware, ironed the napkins, and arranged the place cards as if we were hosting royalty. Mine read Maribel, written in her smallest handwriting. I'd been seated at the far end of the table, near the swinging door to the kitchen, just close enough to pass serving bowls, just far enough to be out of focus. Jared, of course, sat next to Mom at the head, basking in her laughter and the admiration of the neighbors she'd invited. People who used to ask how I was, but tonight barely met my eyes. Mom raised her glass, beaming. "To Jared," she said, "the next steward of the Quinn name." There were murmurs of agreement, light clapping. I smiled and nodded like I always had, even as I felt my pulse in my throat. Jared stood. "Thank you, Mom, really, and thank you all for being here. I've been thinking about revitalizing things around here, starting with the backyard." He laughed softly. "That shed has got to go. Maybe a greenhouse or a pool house, something that adds value." A few guests chuckled. Mom grinned like she'd just been handed blueprints. I sipped my water and looked down the table, fingers resting on the edge of my plate. The turkey was dry. No one dared say it. The doorbell rang. Mom looked up, surprised. "Are we expecting someone?" "I am," I said, rising slowly. I walked through the foyer and opened the door to find Thomas standing in his charcoal coat, holding a bottle of wine with a small tag tied around the neck. He smiled and handed it to me. "To the quiet ones who build legacies," it read. "Right on time," I said. When we returned to the table, all heads turned. Thomas extended a polite nod to the room, then turned to me. "Boss," he said simply. The room went still. Mom's brow furrowed. Jared looked confused. I motioned toward the empty chair beside me, and Thomas took it. Before anyone could recover, Mr. Adler stepped through the side door from the kitchen, holding a manila envelope. "I believe you were expecting a deed discussion," I said, my voice calm but clear. Mr. Adler cleared his throat and began reading from the papers. The language was dry, legal, absolute. The land behind the Quinn residence, including the shed and 2 adjacent lots, was the legal property of Belrose Holdings, a trust transferred by Mrs. Thorne and now managed solely by me. If you were me, would you have spoken up or stayed silent like I did for years? Some wounds aren't loud, but they shape everything. If this moment stirred something in you, please comment number 9 below. Now, let's see what happens next. Jared opened his mouth, then closed it. Mom's grip on her wine glass tightened. Thomas leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Technically," he said, his tone light but unmistakably firm, "she owns what you plan to build on, and maybe more." I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of what had been unspoken for years finally settle around them. Then I stood, looking directly at the 2 people who had built a life where I was a footnote. I look at Jared, then at Mom. I didn't strike back out of spite. I stepped forward because you never saw me standing here. You can't rebuild trust with blueprints, but you can start with the truth. The cold had settled in fully now, the kind that made your breath visible and your fingers ache even through gloves. I stood in the backyard, boots crunching lightly on the frost-covered ground, as two local contractors walked the perimeter, placing neon orange survey flags along the snow-dusted lawn. Their voices were low, respectful, not pushing for small talk. I appreciated that. One of them handed me a fresh cup of coffee, black, no sugar, just the way I took it. We stood in silence for a moment, both staring at the old cherry tree near the fence line. "We can work around it," he said. "Would be a shame to lose something that's been here longer than the house." I nodded. "It stays?" The man nodded back and moved on, marking the next point. I sipped the hot coffee and let the warmth settle into my chest. The bitter taste felt grounding. Footsteps on gravel pulled my attention toward the gate. Jared approached, his coat unbuttoned, hands in his pockets. His breath fogged the air before him, but his expression was clear, unsettled, searching. "You're really doing this?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I handed the coffee back to the contractor and thanked him, then walked a few steps toward my brother. "This wasn't about payback," I said. "It was never about punishing anyone." Jared looked around. I thought everything would fall into place, like it always had." "And that's the problem," I said quietly. "You thought the place was already yours." He let out a small laugh, bitter and brief. "I didn't mean it like that." "But you didn't mean it any other way either, did you?" I paused. "You assumed I'd always be around, useful, background." He didn't respond. His hands were shoved deeper into his pockets now. I watched his gaze drift toward the shed. It stood quietly at the edge of the property, small but solid, just like I'd kept myself all these years. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. But it wasn't anger in his voice. It was something closer to disappointment, in himself. "Because you never asked," I replied. "Not once." The front porch creaked. Constance stepped out slowly, wrapped in her wool coat, arms crossed tightly. Her gloves were mismatched, something she never would have tolerated when I was little. She didn't speak until she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice thinner than I remembered. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out Mrs. Thorne's letter. I had opened it the night before, after the dinner, when the house had gone still. Inside, written in her careful cursive, was a note and a photograph. I unfolded the letter now and began to read aloud. "Maribel, when I had no one, you showed up. With soup, with silence, with your whole heart. People talk about who deserves what, but trust isn't deserved. It's chosen. You are my choice. Use what I give you to make something beautiful, even if they never understand why." I held up the photograph for a moment. It was of me, age 15, standing beside Mrs. Thorne in her garden. We were both laughing. I had never seen it before. Her handwriting on the back simply read, "Family is who sees you." Jared looked away. "I'm not selling the land," I said, voice steady now. "I'm building something new." They waited. "It'll be called the Walter Quinn Center for Quiet Strength. A studio, a gathering space for creatives who go unseen and elders who need a voice. It's not just concrete and walls. It's space to feel like you matter." Constance's face was unreadable. Her hand loosened slightly on her coat sleeve. Her gaze dropped to the ground, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Walter would have liked that," she said softly. "I think he would have," I agreed. "He used to say that roots aren't just where you plant. They're who shows up, day after day." The surveyors continued their quiet work behind us. One stopped to adjust a flag, then gave me a thumbs up before heading toward his truck. The sky above was pale and overcast, the kind that promised more snow before sunset. I stepped back, glancing again at the cherry tree, still standing tall against the wind. It had seen birthdays, arguments, laughter, silence. It had endured. Constance spoke again, almost to herself. "You named it after your father?" Maribel, gently. "He was the last one who made me feel like I belonged here. Some storms pass, some reshape the landscape, and some let the sun back in." The first snowfall had come soft, like it didn't want to disturb anything, just dusting at first, brushing the windowsill of my new place and powdering the lawn below. I stood by the window in wool socks and an oversized sweater, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Outside, survey flags still marked the lines of the future Walter Quinn Center. The foundation had been poured last week. Now, it waited, like me, for something to take root. The small evergreen I'd brought in from the nursery sat near the window, undecorated, undecided. Maybe next week. Or maybe it was fine, just like that. I picked up the envelope on the table. Cream-colored. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a short note and a newspaper clipping. Mrs. Ellie Thorne, 84, passed away in her sleep. The note was dated 3 weeks ago. "Maribel, you made my last season feel like spring. Whatever you build next, make sure there's music, tea, and silence that feels like home. Love, Ellie." I read it 3 times, then placed it gently beside the sink. The radio played something soft. Sinatra, I think. "You make me feel so young." A voice from another time, threading through the quiet of my little kitchen. My phone buzzed with a new email. Jared. The subject line just said, "Peace. Maribel, I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I want you to know I finally get it. I've moved out west, starting over in small ways. Maybe someday we'll sit down again, maybe not. But I hope you're well. You deserve to be. Jay." I stared at the screen for a long time, then closed the email. No need to reply. Not yet. Around 10, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Constance standing on the porch, bundled in her long gray coat, her gloved hands cradling a small wooden box. "I didn't call," she said, voice low. "I wasn't sure I'd come at all." I stepped aside and let her in. She moved like someone walking through memory, slow, reverent, uncertain. She placed the box on my table and opened it. Inside was a photo I hadn't seen in decades, our family at the county fair. Dad in his flannel jacket, Jared holding a balloon, and me, centered, smiling, holding a prize pie I'd won in the kids' baking contest. "I found it going through your father's things," she said. "I think he meant for you to have it." We sat in silence for a while. No need to fill it. The clock ticked gently in the background, and the tea kettle hissed just enough to remind us it was there. I reached into the side drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. An old letter, one I had written when I was 10. A letter I'd hidden beneath the shed floorboards and recovered just last week. It began, "Dear Mom, I wish you'd see me." I looked at her now. "I never sent this," I said, placing it gently in the fireplace. "But I think I'm ready to let it go." She watched the paper curl in the flame, eyes glassy. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't need to accept me as I was. Just see me as I am." I turned to her. "I do now," she said. A moment passed, then another. The fire snapped, the kettle calmed, and something in the air shifted. Later that afternoon, a neighbor boy knocked shyly at the door, cheeks red from the cold, holding a foil-covered dish. "My grandma said to bring you this. We made it at the center. Apple pie." I thanked him, then stepped onto the porch. The snow had started again, quiet and steady, like the land was exhaling. As the snow falls, I step onto the porch. No applause, just quiet. And for once, it's enough. Some homes don't collapse with walls. They vanish when your place at the table disappears. But sometimes when the dust settles, you find that quiet can be a foundation too. I've learned that unconditional kindness doesn't need an audience, and real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply stays. A deed offered in silence can speak louder than a speech shouted across generations. When we stop measuring people by the roles we assumed they'd play, we make room for who they truly are. Like the first snow blanketing a worn field, compassion reshapes the ground, without erasing its history. If this story reminded you of someone you once overlooked, or someone who quietly stood by, maybe today is the day to reach back. And if it touched a quiet corner of your heart, feel free to leave a comment or subscribe. I'd love to keep sharing stories that make space for grace